Let's now go to our correspondent, Susan Teherani, who is live in New York. Susan, there has been a deal in the offing. This is according to the U.S. government and also the Qatari government. What do we know so far about this?
So, Eric, as you mentioned, this talk of a deal has been going on since this weekend, where the United States officially announced that the deal is very close. Yesterday, we heard John Kirby say that a deal is very close for the release of hostages, about 50 hostages in Hamas captivity, in return for about 5 days of humanitarian pause. I want to stress on that 5 day because that's the amount of days that humanitarian agencies at the United Nations recommended to the Security Council is needed for aid to get in and the hostages to be released possibly. And that's why the Security Council passed finally some sort of humanitarian resolution just last week. So the 5 days is important. We know these numbers are going around. We don't know first how many hostages, but around 50. But today, because President Biden just a few minutes ago announced that a deal is very close, there are those that believe that perhaps this sort of interim ceasefire, a humanitarian pause will happen in the next 24 hours. But again, a lot of questions left unanswered, how this is going to happen. And, you know, this assurance by the U.S. government perhaps is a glimmer of hope, at least those who have hostages in Hamas captivity.
All right, Susan, let's now bring in our correspondent, Jody Cohen, who is in Israel. Jody Cohen is joining us live on the line. Jody Cohen, I just spoke to the Israeli government spokesperson. He says that he knows about the deal, but he cannot say much about the deal. What do we know so far from the Israeli government about this so-called deal in the offing?
Hi, Eric. So yes, like Susan, I've been talking much of today about comments that we have been getting from Israeli officials, from the Qatari foreign minister, also from Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, all indicating, also the White House spokesperson John Kirby and now President Biden, all indicating that we're the closest we have been so far to a hostage, I should say a partial hostage release deal. Now, we know that the Israeli cabinet is going to be meeting. There are reports that they're going to be voting on a potential
We seem to have lost Jody. We'll try to get her back. Susan, coming back to you, what is the White House saying about the hostage situation and the attacks on Gaza so far? Because the stance has changed over time.
Not their general stance, Eric. You know this as well as all of us, that their general stance is Israel has the right to defend itself. Whether or not President Biden is being pressured for calling for some sort of pause on the one hand and not a ceasefire, and calling on Israel to abide by international laws of war, you know, that's another situation. After all politics are local, and he's running for re-election, and a lot of these criticism come from within his home party in this swing states. But their general stance that Israel has this right to defend itself and get rid of Hamas is intact. But regarding the hostages, the president today said we are now very close, very close. We could bring some of these hostages home very soon, but I don't want to get into the details of things because nothing is done until is done. He just recently said this during the White House. But nonetheless, you know, the United States has been in this situation before regarding deployment to Afghanistan and Iraq, and we see the Israelis in the same situation. There's a very small window of opportunity for these militaries to be able to carry out attack without international outcry, without not having the public behind them. And I think that window is closing for Israel, and hence, you know, for President Biden's support as well, as we see in his poll numbers.
Susan Teherani is our correspondent in New York. Thank you, Susan. Jody Cohen, we had lost you a little bit there, but now you're back. Jody, what are Israelis saying about what is happening in Gaza right now? Because apart from the deal, the hostage situation deal, what are Israelis feeling about the Israeli onslaught on Gaza?
Right. So I think, first of all, front of mind right now in Israel and across the country will be on the plight of the 240 roughly hostages being held in Gaza since the 7th of October massacre. And then the second thing is related also to the second goal of Israel. The first goal is being to secure the release or rescue all of those hostages. And their second goal that they've said is to dismantle Hamas. And that's because Hamas has said as recently as last week that they plan to carry out more 7th of October style massacres against Israelis, quote, again and again and again. So really, front of mind are the hostages. I've been at the hostage square in Tel Aviv today speaking with family members of those who have been kidnapped, and their real anguish that they're being felt is also being felt across the country. So the priority is absolutely to get as many hostages out as quickly as possible and to ensure their safety. But the second is, in terms of the long run, is to, from Israel's perspective, is to ensure that Hamas are not in a situation where they can infiltrate the border, where they can kill more than 1,000 people in a day and take 240 hostages across the border back to Gaza.
Jody, finally, and in real sense, how active is the war cabinet? And what's the feeling, the public feeling about the war cabinet? Is it effective enough?
The war cabinet is very effective. There's a smaller war cabinet, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Gallant, War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz, and some other observers as well. And they are meeting regularly. They are actually meeting this evening at 8 o'clock local time. You've got the wider Israeli cabinet and then this smaller war cabinet who are meeting, both reportedly to vote on whether or not to approve of this deal that is being discussed to release some of the hostages in exchange for a pause in fighting and also in exchange for the release of some Palestinian prisoners, reportedly those not convicted of murder and terror attacks against Israelis. So there is a feeling that the war cabinet is working. There is a general feeling that the wider cabinet isn't so involved, but that's because there's this smaller, broader war cabinet that includes Benny Gantz, who had, remember, been in the opposition, who's a leader of one of the parties there, very prominent politician in Israel and a former defense minister. And I think that there is trust in this war cabinet that they are working to do what they can to secure the release of the hostages. Right. But we'll see later on tonight what happens with this potential deal.
Jody, as I'm talking to you, there are live protests going on in Tel Aviv, in Israel. Have you managed to talk to some of these protesters? Because it looks like it's late at night, but people are still on the streets.
So today I didn't see what would be described as a protest. So I've spent the whole day in Tel Aviv with the families. I would describe it more as a vigil, but as I was driving around Tel Aviv, I did see a handful of people who were trying to block one of the roads and were with megaphones and were protesting, calling out in Hebrew for a deal now, that's what they kept on saying. I wouldn't describe it as a protest, though. I think on the whole, there is an understanding that the families of the hostages are in a terribly anguished situation, and they want to do as much as they can to make sure that the international community stays focused on securing a deal to release the hostages, but also that the Israeli government, as I said, they have two goals. One goal is to secure the release of the hostages, and the second goal is to dismantle Hamas. And they want to make sure that both of those happen, but their priority is understandably the hostages and their relatives.
Mm-hmm. Jody, we had some statements from the World Health Organization and also the EU Foreign Policy Chief. He says that, I'll actually read a statement from the EU Foreign Policy Chief, who says that one horror does not justify another horror. And also the World Health Organization Chief Antonio Guterres, who says that we are witnessing a killing of civilians that is unparalleled and unprecedented in any conflict since I became Secretary General. Some of these statements being made by these agencies, are they reaching Israel, and how is Israel reacting to them?
Absolutely. So I think the Israeli government's response to that would be even one civilian death is an absolute tragedy, but that they would say the responsibility for that lies with Hamas, that there was a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas on the 6th of October, and that was broken by that massacre that took place the next day. In terms of the civilian numbers, also the Israel is saying that those numbers are coming from Hamas, so there's no certainty on the civilian numbers, but that they know that Hamas is including Hamas terrorists and civilians in those tallies together. There's also a feeling, I have to say, from the spokesperson, Eylon Levy of the Prime Minister's office. He's been taking to X to call on, to question, I should say, the UN organizations and the World Health Organization in Gaza, saying how is it possible that, having seen the evidence of the tunnels of Hamas militants, of weapons inside civilian places like hospitals, how is it possible that they weren't aware of Hamas doing their activities in civilian areas? And I think this is one area that the Israeli government will be discussing with those UN agencies.
All right, live from Ra'anana, Israel, our correspondent Jody Cohen on the line. Thank you, Jody. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.